Hey guys, Argent here. So I thought for Halloween this might be a good topic. Why do I like horror so much? As you notice, I do a lot of videos related to horror movies. I talk a lot about it. I'm a big fan of horror, and people are probably wondering, well, RG, why are you a big fan of horror? Well, in retrospective, as a kid, I just couldn't take horror movies. They just scared me. I would stay up late, etc. But as I got older and I got less and less afraid of the supernatural, I kind of grew to like them. I remember it was first year university where I first started watching horror movies with any kind of regularity, and I immediately just kind of started to develop kind of a love for them. It's kind of hard to say where really the first couple I watched were. Paranormal Activity, I remember, is the first horror movie I ever really went to see in theaters and was really interested in. I think I really got into it because of the found footage genre. I really like Paranormal Activity. Blair Witch Project was good. Just a lot of that stuff. I kind of after I watched Paranormal Activity, I kind of this genre is interesting. I'm gonna start watching some of the classic horror movies. So I watched Halloween, which I liked a lot. I watched Friday the 13th Part One, which I did not like. I watched Nightmare on Elm Street, which I thought was good. The Omen, which I thought was really good, and The Exorcist, which was really good. And kind of as I started just watching more and more of them, I guess over time I've drifted further and further away from sci-fi, because sci-fi and to a lesser extent fantasy used to kind of be the main genres I was interested in. As a kid, I read a lot of sci-fi books. I was really into Star Wars, Star Trek, Dragonlance, kind of all that fun stuff. But over time, I've kind of drifted more and more towards horror as kind of being my favorite genre. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I remember when I was back in university, a friend of mine referred to horror as being the most puritanical genre. And over time, I think there is a lot of truth to that. I think to a large extent, horror is the most right wing or kind of the most conservative, in a sense, well, not really conservative, but kind of the most right wing genre of film. This is despite its rampant sex, drugs, violence, etc. So let's go into detail about that. Why do I like horror? Why do I kind of consider it right wing compared to a lot of genres? First and foremost, the whole kind of concept of horror is very Christian in its orientation. If you notice in most horror movies, there's an aspect of original sin. And this is kind of also where Lovecraftian horror comes from. They aren't incompatible and they're rather similar, Christian horror and Lovecraftian horror. You see, in Christianity, the fall of man came about because of original sin. Adam and Eve were disobedient to God. They disobeyed the natural order. They broke the natural law. They sinned. And in punishment for the sin, their world was shattered, and the wages of sin are death. So death entered the world. They had to toil at the earth for food. People started killing one another. We had Cain and Abel bash each other's head in. We had demons entering the world, etc. So in traditional kind of Christian morality and in it's kind of secular variants like Lovecraftian horror, there's always an aspect of an original sin which sparks things off. In Sinister, it's him looking at the videotapes instead of turning them into the police. They really should have turned the videotapes in. He should have confronted someone else about it. He shouldn't have gone there. It was forbidden to him, and it was obviously forbidden. But because of much like Adam and Eve, he said, well, I want to know good and evil. I want to see the universe for how it really is. And in doing that, he was punished for that. In The Ring, they also watched the videotape when they really shouldn't. They should have left it well enough alone. They should have destroyed it as soon as they saw it. But they wind up watching it, and they wind up showing it to more and more people, and the knowledge is infectious. Generally speaking, in Lovecraft stories, and I've been rereading them, there's kind of a theme that cosmic evil is so large and powerful, it's blind to you so long as you're blind to it. Once you start investigating the deeper mysteries of the universe and seeking power from them and seeking knowledge that humans were not meant to possess, the higher powers become interested in you, and that will lead to your destruction. And kind of that's kind of a reoccurring theme through most horror films. In the Paranormal Activity movies, there's normally an aspect of that. They don't contact someone to help them when they should have. In the first one, they try to actively provoke the demon. Oftentimes, there's they try to go to a fortune teller. They try to do a magical ritual. In the movie The Apparition, they attempt to create life using some sort of psychographic machine, etc. And I mean, that's kind of like what Frankenstein is. Dr. Frankenstein tried to play God, and he gave birth to the creature. So horror is ultimately a very karmatic genre, and it's ultimately a very moralistic genre, almost to a Puritan extent. If you notice in old slasher movies, generally speaking, what would happen is the kids would be punished for sex. Like in Friday the 13th, Jason and his reason for existence is because he drowned as a kid while his teen counselor was having sex. And so as kind of a result of this, Jason has kind of come to view sex as an evil thing. And in a lot of the Friday the 13th movies and slasher movies in general, they kill kids for having unmarried sex. So it's kind of viewed as perhaps a disproportionate punishment of sin, but roughly kind of in accordance with this kind of Old Testament style morality. Other forms of punishment are for not believing in something, for pride, for self-righteousness, for not being able to accept your own faults, etc. Generally speaking, in most horror movies, the ultimate downfall of the characters, even if it is disproportionate, is triggered by some initial act or initial sin that the person's not able to reconcile with themselves. And to a large extent, the monster, as it were, represents, I think as Jung would say, the shadow, or the kind of the dark parts of yourself. The creatures normally are to some extent the opposite or very similar to what they're destroying. And that's kind of one form of horror. The other form is a bit more nihilistic, where it's just viewed as an impossible force of evil that's just completely arbitrary and cruel, which I don't tend to like because I just kind of find it excessively depressing. My problem with a lot of horror movies is I kind of feel the people should survive them more. I kind of feel if the people come to terms with whatever their personal failing is and kind of seek redemption for it, then they should not die, which was what I liked about the movie Deliver Us from Evil, because they didn't die in that. And they didn't die in As Above, So Below, because they were able to come to terms with their problems and leave it behind. But yes, ultimately, in most horror movies, there is a very strong sense of morality. It may be a twisted sense of morality, but it's there. Like, even within the Saw movies, which I've never watched because they just look really depressing torture porn, the character of Jigsaw views himself as being a vigilante. He views his purpose as to make people feel grateful for being alive, to make people really feel alive and to really experience life. And a lot of the people he punishes are people who do things. Like, I think there was one guy who faked a suicide attempt to get attention, and Jigsaw put him in a situation where he would basically have to kill himself, etc. So there is normally that. Very often the villain, like Jason, is born from some sort of sin, be it negligence, be it like in Hollow Man, a military experiment. Horror is kind of, as a genre, kind of the antithesis of science fiction. Science fiction states that unlimited exploration, an unlimited and almost naive belief in man's potential and man's ability to do the right thing, kind of a naive faith almost in the future. I know there's dystopian science fiction, but Science fiction, as it was originally conceived, was a lot more optimistic, and horror kind of takes the alternate view and says, no, man is not this Enlightenment caricature. Man is not this great thing that is perfect, that's flawless. I kind of find science fiction is very much reminds me of kind of the communist idea of the new man, the scientific man, the man who is post emotion, post historical, and horror posits that the darkness within the soul is an intransable part of humanity. It will always be there. Man will always have these dark desires in his soul. He will always have these dark needs. He will always be craving blood and death and sex and murder. And horror, I find, really does kind of touch at that. Horror also, I think we've explored that theme, deals with a lot of issues that other movies won't deal with. Horror movies are by far the movies that deal with religion the most. In a lot of other movies, no one is noticeably religious ever. Even in movies that are like period pieces, like in the medieval era, everyone seems to be an atheist. In horror movies, the question of religion is very often brought up. There's very often characters who are religious in some form. Very often issues of a religious nature are addressed, be they angels, demons, ghosts, the afterlife, etc. And very often complicated moral choices are presented in horror movies. Like in The Ring, for instance, the moral choice facing the what's her name's I forget her name. The main character is whether or not to show the videotape to other people, which might get them killed but would save her. Does she show the videotape to her daughter? Does she get her, like, is it worth killing someone else to save her daughter? So there's always questions like that. Maybe there's someone who needs to be sacrificed, etc. Maybe someone needs to die in order to stop the monster. I mean, there's often a question of sacrifice or death being redemption in horror movies. There's often a question of whether or not the spirit is right to get even. There's a question of whether or not people deserve death. There's a question of just a lot of interesting kind of moral issues and themes that aren't really explored elsewhere. Like in Sinister, the whole film's kind of about the power of the image, the power of the media, and the power of transmission of ideas to influence and control people. The last broadcast was also about that. They kind of deal with these issues kind of in a way sci-fi used to be. Because science fiction used to be kind of to... the science fiction, like in a lot of, I guess, more soft sci-fi, not really hard sci-fi. Soft sci-fi was more that the situations you were in were a projection kind of to explore whatchamacallit, fund existential issues. Like Minority Report is not really about the technology. It's about kind of the moral questions that Seeing the Future would raise. It's about kind of the fundamental question, can you, for the greater good, arrest someone who has not committed a crime? And what are the moral responsibilities of a technology of like that? And that's kind of what sci-fi originally was, and it's kind of drifted, I think, away from that over time, partially just as a result of it getting more and more left-wing. But I find horror will still try to deal with these issues. Issues of survival, issues of morality, issues of wielding and using power, issues of what to do to survive. Like, there just are often find a lot more kind of interesting plots in them. Like in The Exorcist, which I regard as one of the best horror movies of all time, the film is very much about a man who's a cynic regaining his faith. The man has lost his faith, and by the end of the movie, he has regained it so much that he's willing to lay down his life and sacrifice it to send the demon back to hell and save the girl. It's kind of the interesting movies. The issue of religion just isn't really dealt with, I find, outside of horror. Horror is often very gothic, very kind of traditional in its visual style. You always have, like, if Catholics are portrayed, it's like pre-Vatican II Catholics in like traditional garb. There's always like nuns. It shows like the active battle of good versus the forces of evil. As Michael Corden said before he kind of just went crazy and went back to Anglicanism. In Hollywood movies, whenever they need to fight real evil, that is the devil, they always call in Catholic priests. They always call in God and the Catholic Church to fight against real evil. And I think it really, whenever Catholicism's portrayed in these movies, like the Conjuring, it's really kind of this portrayal of a much more masculine, manly church that's fighting against the forces of evil, that's saving souls, that is really kind of taking a center stage in terms of relevance to a person's life. Because to a lot of people, religion just doesn't play a relevance in their life anymore. But in horror, these transcendent themes of good, evil, knowledge and ignorance, demons and angels are all very active and involved in people's lives. And I think as a genre, that's why I like it so much. There's a lot of other things. I just find horror movies interesting. I find them just kind of visually interesting to watch. I often like the music. I know this is kind of going to take away from the rest of what I've said, but horror movies, for whatever reason, I find have the best looking actresses of any genre. They seem to just always find like these really, really gorgeous women who are not like big name actresses, but generally speaking look better than them. I find a lot of big name actresses aren't really that good looking. Oftentimes you often will just find like girls on the street who look significantly better than them. And kind of horror movies often have kind of a very, the women in them I find often look rather kind of, not really traditional, but they just don't look exceptionally degenerate, even if there is a fair amount of sex in horror movies. I just don't find them that boring. I find they often will deal with an interesting topic. If they're bad, I find they normally aren't unwatchably bad. Horror movies are often really kind of funny or amusing if they're bad. Like there's some genres I can't watch bad movies in. But in horror, I'm kind of equally happy if it's a good horror movie or a bad horror movie. I think it's a genre that's underutilized and could really do with some more people taking it seriously and kind of putting some more work into it. But overall, those are kind of my thoughts on it. Happy Halloween. This is Archie, signing out.